Does anybody not have the word fasting in their Bible? Sorry, that was an odd question. That didn't make any sense. If you have the word fasting in that story in your Bible, can you raise your hand? Okay. Who has prayer in theirs? Just prayer, no fasting. Most everybody else. Okay. Kind of a freaky story, right? This child is possessed by a demon or an unclean spirit, whatever your Bible has. It's something that can control this child, and it manifests in the form of epileptic fits or makes him mute. And it's kind of frustrating, I imagine, for Jesus because his disciples can't seem to get it out. A few years ago, I was going through the Bible, doing a daily Bible reading, which seems like that's been a theme this year for you all. But I was looking for the topic of prayer, mostly to better my own prayer life, because this is something that I struggle with. So I was looking for instances where prayer is used, because I'd like to copy those. I'd like to know what they say. How do you talk to God? Things like this. You all can hear me okay, right? Okay. So when I came to Mark, I found it a little interesting that prayer is not talked about that much, but also that Jesus really only prays about 3 different times. In chapter 6, Jesus gives authority to his disciples to go out and to cast out demons. Now, demons is a very big theme in Mark, probably more of a theme in Mark than anybody else. So he gives them this authority in chapter 6 to go and cast out demons, and the disciples, they have watched Jesus do this, they have learned from him, and so Jesus decides, you know what? Now it's your turn. You get to go out and do it. And unlike Matthew and Luke's Gospels, when you have this particular story in chapter 6, when he sends out the 12, Matthew and Luke focus the mission on. They're going to be casting out demons, but they're also going to be healing the sick, curing diseases, teaching. But in Mark, the only focus is proclaiming the gospel and demons. And the disciples have success. But in chapter 9, what was successful before doesn't seem to be working anymore. So what happened? Mark does not lead us to believe that the disciples lost their authority, or like Matthew does, lead us to think that the disciples' faith is weak. Matthew says that, but Mark just says they couldn't do it. And he quotes Jesus as saying that this particular kind can only come out through prayer. So my question at that would be, what is so special about this demon? What sort of power does it have that their method doesn't seem to work on this kind? And I think maybe we've missed the point. Maybe I can't answer that question. So instead, maybe I should ask, what is so important about prayer that seems to be effective? Like I said, prayer does not make much of an appearance in the book. Jesus only prays 3 times. And so this morning, I'd like to look at that story in chapter 9 to maybe have a clearer understanding of why prayer might have worked for that particular demon and for the disciples in that situation. So 3 times that Jesus prays, we're going to walk through each of those stories, and we're going to begin in chapter 1. That's the first time that Jesus prays. You don't have to follow along, but you can if you want. So beginning in chapter 1, and the first 13 verses of Mark describes Jesus in a very clear picture. He is the Son of God, he is anointed by the Holy Spirit, and after being tempted by the devil, we learn that he is stronger than the devil. But notice that Jesus does not begin his ministry immediately with healing the sick, or feeding people, or addressing those in need. Jesus' first public acts after he selects his disciples are 2 things. The first, and most important, teaching, and dealing with a demonic force. So let me set the scene for you. Jesus is teaching in the synagogue. It is the Sabbath. And as he's talking, somebody from the back, I'm going to guess, decides to get up and start making a racket. Now, I don't imagine that this demon was rude. And by rude, I mean making snide comments under his breath, being annoying, because I imagine that this demon is afraid of Christ. And so, Jesus is saying something that makes this unclean spirit uncomfortable, and so he finally stands up and comes to the front, possibly, and says, I know exactly who you are. You are the Holy One of God. Now this, cutting in that room's attention. Is the microphone cutting out? Okay, I'll try and hopefully if I can time it. This should really get the crowd's attention. Here you have this man. I don't know how he got into the temple. I don't even know why that demon decided to sit there. But he has been, and he's been irritated enough to speak up. But the fact that this demonic power, this powerful force in this man, calls out the person speaking, identifies him, and says, "You are the Holy One of God," and shows fear to this person, that alone should get the people's attention. But Jesus doesn't allow that to progress. He simply says, "That's enough. Be quiet." Interestingly enough, the same phrase Jesus uses there is the exact same phrase he uses when he calms the storm. And he commands the demon, "Come out." And the demon shakes the man violently, and it comes out however it decides to come out, seeping through the pores, out the mouth, whatever. But it comes out of him. And then news begins to spread about what Jesus has done. People are just astonished. But what exactly is getting spread about Jesus in this point? By the end of the story, I'm going to guess that what's getting spread is not really what Jesus wanted to get spread around. By the end of the section, Jesus goes to the house of Peter's mother-in-law, and they tell him that Peter's mother-in-law is sick, and Jesus, in his compassion, decides to heal the woman, and she gets up, and she's re-energized, and she starts cooking, and putting coffee on, and tea, and she bakes cookies for everybody. Those last three things are not in the story, but she's got enough energy to do all of this to serve people, and then news spreads even more that Jesus has now healed someone. And so in his first day in Mark's gospel, let me take a pause for a second. We think that Mark is the first one to get written. When people get Mark's story, and it's performed in front of a church crowd, a house crowd, likely that first audience only has their own memories of their family and friends who saw Jesus or interacted, and that's it. There is no Matthew, there is no Luke, there is no John. So the story you get here, at least for the first few groups of people, this is all you got. So they can't compare. So Jesus heals the mother-in-law, news begins to spread, and it's at this point that things start to go a little south, in my opinion. By nightfall, Sabbath has come to a close, and people start knocking on the door. I don't imagine that they are knocking on the door to hear a good sermon. I don't think that they're knocking on the door because a demon said, "This is the Holy One of God." I think they're knocking on that door because they want Jesus to do something for them. I think they want Jesus to heal their family. And they want Jesus to cast out demons from their family and close friends. And that's what Mark tells you. They're coming to bring the sick and the demon-possessed, and Jesus doesn't get mad that we know of. In his compassion, he heals them. I don't know how long Jesus sat there doing that. Might have taken all night. Judging by the character that we get in the Gospels, I think Jesus took as long as it took to get the mission done. But by the next morning, in Mark's Gospel, you get the impression that things aren't right for Jesus. Because what does he do? Do you remember? He just leaves. He gets up. Now, don't think he's getting up and going for a jog. He gets up and goes for a walk to a solitary place. In Mark, when Jesus goes to a solitary place, he's either going to heal somebody to get away from the crowd, or that's where John speaks. But in this particular one, he goes to a solitary place and he prays. And this is the first time that prayer is mentioned. Why is he praying? What's important about prayer here? It would appear that things aren't going the way that Jesus intended them to go. I can guess that because I think that Mark hints at that. Peter and his friends get up the next morning and notice that Jesus isn't there, and they go looking for Jesus. Now, you should not think that this is an example of Peter and his friends going for a jog as well and just bumping into Jesus. This is an example of, as Mark frames it here, that they are hunting Jesus down. Peter says, "Where have you been? Everyone is looking for you." And you should know that in the Greek, that particular word is used only 10 times in Mark. And every time it's used, when somebody is seeking Jesus out, it is only in instances where somebody is trying to interfere or when something is interfering with Jesus' ministry. And so Peter says, "Dude, where have you been? We got up and you were gone. Everybody's looking for you." And Jesus says, "Yeah, about that. Maybe we should go somewhere else. Maybe to a nearby town so I can teach there also, because that's what I came to do." Why does he pray? Perhaps because he's frustrated. The mission is misinterpreted. And so, faced with this mounting pressure from his teaching and the people and his disciples, Jesus turns to God. Jesus will not pray again until Mark chapter 6. The section opens with Jesus. This is the story I told you earlier. Jesus giving his disciples authority to expel demons, and they're to go out in pairs and continue the work that he's been doing. And in chapter 6, verse 30, he says that they had been successful. The apostles reported to him all that they had done and taught. But when they come back from this mission of expelling demons and teaching, there are so many people who are coming and going that the disciples don't even have a chance to eat. And so Jesus says, hey, should probably go somewhere else so you guys can get some rest and so you can get some to eat. But the crowd has no intention of Jesus going anywhere else. I mean, the message that's being proclaimed is wonderful, and the healings that are going on, my goodness, no, you're not going anywhere. But he does. Him and his disciples get in the boat, and I don't know how the crowd tracked or how that a crowd got wind of Jesus coming, whether it was because maybe somebody in the crowd knew one of the disciples and they said, hey, we're going to go to this location next. I would imagine that either Peter or James or John put on their TikTok what had happened and where they're going next, and that's how the crowd found it. Whatever it is, when Jesus finally docks at the next spot, people are there waiting. And Jesus doesn't get mad. He doesn't say, turn it around. We can't go here. We got to be alone. In his compassion, once again, he decides he is going to teach the people and he is going to feed them. He feeds 5,000 of them, uses the disciples' own food, and feeds these people. But then something happens. Now I'm going to break my own rule, and I'm going to jump over to John for a second, but just for an example. John will tell you that it is at this point in Jesus' ministry that something negative does happen. The people start saying that Jesus needs to be their king, and that they want him to rule over them. And Jesus is not okay with that. And so he forces the disciples into the boat. So John is confirming that what's been happening is that Jesus' mission is being misinterpreted by the crowd. And though Mark doesn't tell you that specifically, what he does do is frame how Jesus tells them to get in the boat, not as a nice command of, hey, just an idea, maybe you guys should get in the boat. In Mark's language, it is, immediately, Jesus pulled his disciples and said, hey, get in the boat now. Get out of here. I will dismiss the crowd. So this is very strange. Things were going well, and all of a sudden, Jesus wants the disciples out, and he pushes the disciples out, and then he goes off and he prays by himself. Again. Perhaps he is praying because things just aren't going the way he wants. And it's not just the crowd who seems to be misinterpreting Jesus' mission as that they want to be fed, that they want food, that they want the power. The disciples don't get it either, because just after that, when Jesus rejoins them, you learn in Mark's gospel, they're still confused as to what's happening. They don't understand. And it's frustrating for Jesus. And that is why, in my opinion, Jesus yet once again turns to prayer. All right, one more story. This is the last time Jesus will pray in the book, and I'm sure you can guess where it is. In the garden. All of the Gospels have Jesus praying in the garden. And as time for Jesus' death grows close, he gathers his disciples together to be with the people that he's closest to, and then he has to break away and get alone, but he still takes Peter, James, and John, but then at that point he is so stressed. If panic attacks were happening back then, that's about what I imagine is going on. He can't breathe, he's sweating, and he pulls the disciples and says, actually, I got to be alone again. And so he tells them to stay watch. Let me just pray. And he goes, and he can't even stand anymore. He falls to his knees, and Mark is the only one that phrases it this way. Matthew and Luke will say, Lord, if you are willing, take it away. But in Mark's gospel, Jesus says, God, you can do anything you want. Take this away from me. It is weighing on his heart, and the man is sweating, as Luke calls it, sweating blood. He is in agony because he knows what's about to happen. It's terrifying. And if he's going to continue in doing God's will, he can't do it alone. In our text this morning from chapter 9, Jesus has just gone up to the mountain with his disciples. It's that story of the transfiguration where, the disciples think that they should, or Peter thinks he should build a tent for Elijah and for Moses. But they come down from the mountain, and the other disciples are there, but there's this argument going on, and Jesus says, what are y'all talking about? And a man says, actually, I brought one of my kids. He probably wasn't laughing. That was a bad version. He says, I brought one of my kids to your disciples, and they couldn't heal him. What's going on? And Jesus sighs and said, "Oh, you unbelieving generation." Who is he talking to? He's talking to the man, the crowd, or the disciples. Mark doesn't tell you, but I think he's talking to both. Jesus has the son come over. When the demon sees Jesus, it goes into a fit, starts gnashing his teeth, rolling around on the ground, and Jesus says, "How long has this been going on?" And the man says, "It's been going on since birth. Uh, Sometimes it tries to drown him, sometimes it tries to burn him. Um, Man, if you can do anything, please have pity on us." And I think that that phrase might have irritated Jesus because he replies with, "If you can. Anything is possible if you believe." And then he says that a crowd, or the Mark says a crowd is starting to come near, and so Jesus says, "All right, out." The demon shrieks inside the child, and it makes him appear as if he's dead. It has done that much damage on his physical body, and then Jesus picks up the child and raises him up. A lot of y'all know that I'm a massage therapist professionally. I started doing that back in 2015. So in the beginning of my schooling, um, they our instructor had us focus on a particular muscle in the body that seems to give people a lot of grief. This is not me giving you any sort of advice. This is just me telling a story, okay? Um, there is a muscle that's called your psoas muscle, and it is connected at your lower back. Now, I am not diagnosing anybody's lower back problems with this, okay? But in my experience, a lot of people's lower back pain can be coming from that psoas muscle. I'm not going to explain why, but the reason I'm saying that is because this instructor wanted us to really focus on helping people to get their psoas muscle relieved or to stop compressing all the time. Unfortunately, because it's on your lower back, you can't, by how it's situated, you can't get to it from the back. You got to go through the front. So it's a little tricky. So we worked on this muscle all the time. And it's a little intimidating because you're having to press in through somebody's stomach all the way down to their spine almost to hit it. So it makes them uncomfortable, makes me uncomfortable, especially in the beginning. Because then if you get somebody who's had stomach surgery, now you got to avoid scar tissue. It's a lot going on. But in the beginning, I get pretty comfortable with it. And we had to work on classmates. We had to do free clinics for several hours on a Saturday where people would come in and you get a free massage. But she said, if they mention the word back pain, you have to address that muscle. That's just part of the course. Cool, got it. So I get somebody who comes in, and I have done the psoas muscle hundreds of times. By this point, I got it. I know what I'm doing. And I'm pressing down, okay? I got the person laying out. And I've explained why I'm doing this. I don't just start pressing in somebody's stomach, but I'm pressing in. I'm not getting anything. And I can't figure out why. So now I'm getting nervous. And I have them pick up their foot and start sliding their foot so I can maybe feel it. Nothing. Okay, now I'm starting to sweat a little bit because they're uncomfortable because this has never been done before. And I'm new at this partially. And so I call our instructor over and I say, "Hey, I don't know what I'm doing." She says, "Well, what's going on?" I said, I can't feel it. Like it's not there." And she says, "Are you pushing hard enough?" And I said, "I think I am." She says, "Oh, yeah, well, sometimes you just got to put an elbow in there." But she takes her hands and she pushes in, and the guy goes, "Oh, that's it. You got it." Feeling like not like hurt, but just that was it. That's where the source of that pain was coming from. Long story short, after that's over, I go to her and I say, "Okay, what happened?" Because I feel like I did everything you said. I was pushing as I was supposed to be, and you said I should put an elbow in there, but you didn't put an elbow in there. She said, "Okay, what do you think went wrong?" "I don't know. That's why I'm asking you. What went wrong?" "Well, I've seen you put elbows in attachment sites of muscles before, so why didn't you try it there?" I said, "Well, I'm just a little uncomfortable. Like, what if I miss?" And she said, "If you know where it is, you shouldn't miss." "Okay, all right." She said, "Look, you're overthinking it. I've seen you work this muscle before. Problem is, you just got in your head. They had stomach surgery. They were a bit of a different body type, so it's a little harder. And you just overthought it, and you got nervous. That's why. It had nothing to do with putting an elbow. It's just, you got to be confident about it." I tell you all that to say, when the disciples come to Jesus and say, "What happened? Why couldn't we do anything?" And Jesus says, "Well, you didn't pray. Neither did you. You didn't say a prayer." But that's not the point. Why is prayer the first thing that Jesus goes to? I think because it is in prayer that we learn that the mission is not ours. It is not we who are in control, and it's not our will that we serve. It can be a confidence issue, but sometimes things just get overwhelming and it throws you off. You don't know what to do. Service in the fellowship with Christ is characterized by a constant awareness that we need God. And in this story, Jesus' disciples are so overwhelmed, despite the fact they have done this 100 times. They went out on their own and did this, and yet they couldn't do it here. And so Jesus' story reminds them that ministry is mine, it's Christ's, it's God's, it's not yours. And it shouldn't discourage them. Instead, when we're in over our heads, we should take time to realize that maybe we need to bring this back to the reason that we're doing it in the first place. Now, some of your versions have prayer and fasting, and both of those redirect our attention to God and to God's will and require a need for strength. I think the same thing can be said, not because we're not casting out demons. At least I hope not. If you are, let me know, because those are fun stories. But I think that we can say the same thing about us. Maybe the ministries that you're doing cause you a lot more stress than they should. And I don't mean ministries that you have here at church. I'm talking about just your life. One of the ways that we proclaim God is not just in how we talk to people, but in how we live our life. Sometimes the way that we live, even though we know we're doing it the right way, people misinterpret what we're doing. They misinterpret what we're saying. They misinterpret how we're acting. Maybe some of your jobs, or sometimes people's jobs, put them in compromising positions that you just don't know what to do. You're trying to do it the way that God wants you to, but it's not working and your life is becoming a little bit too stressful. Or maybe it's your family. Maybe you have a spouse or someone in your family who gives you a lot of opposition. And this is not what you signed up for. This is making Christianity a lot harder. Unfortunately, Jesus was never upfront with saying that being a Christian is easy. It requires a lot, and it's going to create opposition. So no matter how experienced you are in Christianity, you are going to face something that causes you stress. If the Son of God himself faced situations where he had to take a step back and go pray to God to take some of this burden off of him, then why do we think that we are any different? So what are you facing this morning? Like I said, no matter how experienced we think you are when doing God's work, there's always going to be a moment that you face something, either in your family, and your job, and how you respond, that you just can't handle. And it's in those moments that you think, you know what, I can will it to be better. I can demand that it be better. I can even change some of my habits and some of my life things to make it where I don't have to deal with this anymore. But Jesus' story here reminds you that doesn't always work. And when you come to that particular moment where you've done everything that you can, you've done what I taught you, and it's just not changing, well, you got to go back to the person whose will you're doing. You got to give it to God. How do I pray? Kind of like my Sabbath sermon. I don't have a good answer for you there. Mark doesn't give you instruction on how to pray. If you're praying a lot now, you're probably great. Good for you. If you're not praying a lot, the best thing I can say is you just have to start. You have to realize that sometimes you can't do it on your own. You're going to need God. You have to get in that habit, and you have to recognize that it is God who is the only one that can help you. He is the only one that delivers us in these times, and He is the only one that empowers us to be able to fix or to live in the way that He wants us to. Let's all stand and sing.